Greetings, acolytes of the Force, and welcome back to the archives. The Sith Lords of every era each held their own beliefs and principalities that shaped the order of their time. In fact, one might say that their entire plan of conquest hinged on the philosophies held by the current Dark Lord. We plan on releasing a video and a holocron detailing the full Legends timeline of the Sith Order, starting from the ancient Sith purebloods and finishing with Darth Krayt's Rule of One. For this holocron though, we wanted to take a look at each era of the Sith Order and take an analysis of their philosophies and the general mindset that each order had, explaining all of their different eras and beliefs. And by doing this, we will be able to determine the strengths and weaknesses of each era of Sith Lords. So, enter the debate hall with us, my friends, as we dive into the very minds of these Dark Lords, from ancient to modern times. But before we begin, our mystics have seen terrifying visions, some of our viewers have seen our holocrons and have yet to join our order. If you enjoy these videos such as this one, be sure to search your feelings and force crush that subscribe button. Now, into the ancient temples we go. Of course, we must begin at the very beginning, the time of the ancient Sith purebloods. These days of Korriban, the Sith purebloods were a race of people with the dark side embedded into their very culture. The general philosophy can be summed up to survival of the fittest. The strong rule, the weak are slaves. This very simple fact of life was, in all honesty, the only facsimile of what you might call laws or a justice system of this era of the Sith. If you were of the Sith purebloods and you had many things, then they were somehow taken from you. Then all that meant was that you were too weak to have them in the first place, even if the thing taken from you was your very life. It was a barbaric time that was fraught with war between the separate tribes and clans. From what we have observed, it is almost as though the way they lived was a very representation of the most raw form of the dark side itself. Though one thing the native Sith species seemed to respect more than others was bloodshed and their pantheon of gods. Like most primitive species in the galaxy of their time, we can expect to see their culture revolve around serving deities. The god of the ancient Sith was known as Typhogem, or the left-handed god, which we have also made a holocron about before. The Sith revered this being so much that they had thought that the King Adis was the reincarnation of Typhogem, and from this stemmed the legend of the Sith Ari, or the Sith version of the Chosen One. Fast forward to the year 6900 BBY, and the Dark Jedi that were exiled by the Jedi Order would land on the world of Korriban, forever changing what it meant to be a Sith Lord. We can basically count this as another era in and of itself, as Ajunta Pal, the leader of the Dark Jedi, would be the very first Dark Lord of the Sith ever. Ajunta Pal, along with his followers, believed in the freedom to subjugate life as they saw fit through use of the dark side. This is what caused the second great schism in the first place of the Jedi, since the Dark Jedi had discovered new powers and new ways to manipulate life and the Force itself. They were labeled as heretics, but to Ajunta Pal and Sorza's Sin, they were visionaries. They regarded themselves as the true rulers of the galaxy and would begin their vision by conquering the Sith people and putting themselves in the place of their gods. And indeed, the Sith people revered them as such. Interestingly though, the Dark Jedi would all actually be too afraid to ever claim the title of the Sith Ari, as they noticed that it was the one thing that the Sith species valued and regarded as utmost of sacredness. Fearing an uprising, the Dark Jedi would wisely leave that title to Legends, and theirs alone. However, the Dark Jedi Sorza's Sin would be the first to slowly be convinced that the legend was a little more than myth, and she began to wonder if she herself could be this Sith Ari. In the end, they were primitive and colonial, just finally stretching their wings on their dark paths. The third and next era of Sith would begin right around the Great Hyperspace War, when Naga Sadow became a Dark Lord. By this time, the Sith had done away with their old gods and superstitions, focusing entirely on their powers and magic and their worship of the Dark Lord, a living, breathing entity that they could see and touch. They also did away with the titles of king and refused to kneel before a king of any time. Instead, the Sith genuflected before this Dark Lord, who was essentially the term for an ancient emperor. This Dark Lord would preside over a council of Sith Lords. Though the Sith Lords had their own politics and could suggest things, the buck stopped when the Dark Lord made all the decisions and his voice meant finality. We can think of it less as a monarchy and more of like a fascism. To put this in a more clear light, it would be as if the Jedi Grandmaster was also the ruler of the Republic and the Galactic Senate, with the Senate simply being comprised of Jedi Masters from the High Council. Nevertheless, the focus of this era was thought to be entirely on the Empire itself and not the individual. At this point, the Sith themselves weren't a religion yet. They had moved from being a people group to being a government system. In this point in their history, when someone said Sith, it meant the Sith Empire, in the same way that the Republic was its own thing. We can thank Marka Ragnos for this school of thought of the Sith era, since he was the one who ushered in the golden age of the Sith, which this era has been aptly named. It was a time when the dark side was used for the Empire itself, not so much just for the Dark Lord. But I think the issue with this era was that they placed an enormous amount of importance on their Empire, and Korriban as well, as a physical place. So when all of that was taken from them, the Sith would scatter and would essentially be nothing. After Naga Sadow's defeat, however, that's when we entered the era of the Dark Lord being the centerpiece, and no longer the Empire the focus, as the Sith moved from being an established empire to rather an order or a religion, one where the Dark Lord of the Sith would now take the mantle of being the very foundation of their existence. Once men such as Freedon Nad and Exar Kun took center stage, it became a reality where if there was no Dark Lord, there was no Sith. In a sense, we can say that the new Sith were more of like a cult. They learned the dark side from their trusted leader, who demanded full loyalty and admiration from his followers. By utilizing this, they were less concerned about building a kingdom, and more about becoming more powerful in the dark side and destroying their enemies. But the issue with this era of Sith was the role of the Dark Lord itself. They had the opposite problem that the Sith Empire had, where the Sith of this era simply had nowhere to really call home at all. The Dark Lord was their home, their drive, and their entire reason for doing anything. By the very word of their leader, the Sith had no life, so when the Dark Lord was taken away, the Sith would once again die out. The second problem with this is one that Bane later points out, which is that these ancient Dark Lords are incredibly powerful. But when their weaker minions rise up with superior numbers, they can overthrow the powerful Dark Lord and then repeat this in a cycle that ultimately leaves the Sith much weaker. The next era of the Sith begins in the days of the Old Republic, which is around the year 3950 BBY, when Darth Revan began the Jedi Civil War. His and Darth Malak's Sith called a fleet of warships their home. In this era, the Sith began to be heavily militarized. Exar Kun had been the one to really kick off the idea of the Sith becoming their own formal military. Though, when it came to Darth Revan and Malak, they treated being a Sith Lord as something quite meaningful. Darth Nihilus, Sion, and Kreia would also follow this template in their empire as well. In Revan and Malak's movement, along with the triumvirate of the Sith, not just anyone who joined their cause earned the right to be a Sith, only those at the very top. Only those in charge and who led were Sith. The rest were Dark Jedi lackeys who were desperately trying to climb to some level of importance, while not really understanding that they were just being used. This is the first time we can actually see the Sith Order make the clear-cut master and apprentice dynamic take center stage, which is monumental. We can look at the influence from the Jedi as the reason for this, in fact. Ever since Freedon Nad, who started the trend of Jedi falling into Sithhood, we can begin to see small influences of Jediism that is carried over into the Sith Order, which would later become the very foundation of the Rule of Two. In fact, Darth Treya and the Sith Triumvirate would be when they finally see the Sith begin to place their very complete and total dedication to the dark side itself, beyond an empire and beyond an individual, finally becoming the religious order that we know them to be today. So not only in this era did they adopt taking on an apprentice, but also it became a religion rather than an order or an empire. However, there is also another version of Sith residing in this era, when Darth Vitiate would return with his Sith Empire as well. Vitiate conducted his empire the same way that Marka Ragnos' Sith Empire was back in the day when Vitiate was born. However, Vitiate's empire was much more powerful. It would make sense that the Sith Empire would eventually go back to the old ways, seeing as how that was the empire that Darth Vitiate knew. The Sith Emperor had absolute and total control, but delegated a lot more power to the Dark Council, so that the Council could manage the tedium of the Empire, as well as help with the war effort. We see a sort of combination between the militarized Sith and the Imperial Sith, where they place less importance on the dark side itself, and mostly use it as a tool for their soldiers. Perhaps the only one who cared for the dark side in all of its true power would in fact be Vitiate. though perhaps we can say he mostly liked to worship himself and liked the idea of himself becoming a god by using much of the Force and using as much of the dark side as possible, rather than him actually worshipping the dark side itself. In fact, Vitiate saw himself as outright owning the Force later on in his life. Unfortunately for the Sith Empire, the Dark Council was far more focused on their politics, which would hurt them in the end, as this began a cycle of infighting and backstabbing on a very high level, which of course put the Empire at risk. The fall of the Second Sith Empire gave the Sith a much needed rest, when Darth Ruin arose and caused the Fourth Great Schism. We see him taking after Revan and the Sith Triumvirate as well, being inspired by them. Again, we can look to Ruin implementing the influences of the Jedi Order into the revived and re-envisioned Sith. They would place far more emphasis on the dark side itself and seek its power with more fervor, looking to it rather than to themselves for power and guidance like how the Jedi did the light. However, this is where we begin to see a death cycle of assassinations, and the Sith take one step forward and two back, as all the Sith began to desire the position of power that came with being the Dark Lord. Since the Dark Lord itself was not intrinsically tied to the survival of the Order, it made it easier for another Sith to backstab the Dark Lord and then take that role for themselves. But with that strength came a glaring weakness. Who needs to fight and destroy the Sith if they're always fighting and destroying themselves? And with this, finally, came a solution made by the Sith Lord, Lord Khan. Lord Khan introduced a communism into the Sith Order by rallying all of the Sith Lords together and claiming that they are all equal to one another. And it is here where the Brotherhood of Darkness is born, a peaceful coalition of Sith Lords that make themselves stronger with a handshake and an acknowledgement of each other's fellow lordship. They dismissed the Darth title altogether, believing that it represented bygone eras of the Dark Lord, and the Dark Lords rising above the rest rather than fighting as a single unit. This may have worked at the time, but it soon became frighteningly clear that perhaps the Sith had taken too much influence from the Jedi, and now had almost become like a dark, twisted parody of the Jedi Order itself. The man to correct this would be one that we all know well, and that is none other than Darth Bane, who not only brought back the Darth title, but as well the old ways of the Sith. However, he made a major change. The philosophy of the Rule of Two can boil down to this: one master and one apprentice, one to embody power and the other to crave it. Darth Bane is the creator and author of the Rule of Two. Bane believed that the dark side was like a venom, powerful in one, but weak when diluted among many. Too many Sith Lords made the dark side somehow weak. Not only this, but removing infighting took away the aspect of the dark side that made the Sith strong, this being their conniving nature. However, Bane had another problem. He observed how the ancient Sith Lords would be destroyed when their many lesser minions overtook them, leaving a much weaker Sith in command. Bane sought to literally reverse this process by setting up a cycle that would ensure total victory. The Rule of Two would have it so that each Sith Master would secretly train an apprentice. When that apprentice would learn all they needed from their master and become too strong for them, they would kill their master and then take their place. Then, they would train their own apprentice for the same reason, starting the cycle anew. Theoretically, this cycle would continue with each new Sith Lord more powerful than the last, making the Sith Order as a whole stronger with every passing generation. What resulted was, of course, Darth Sidious, a man who embodied everything the Sith had come up with until that point, and for all intents and purposes, the anointed one of the dark side itself. Sidious himself was an absolute zealot for the dark side, and spent most of his time in deep research of it, collecting many artifacts and much knowledge. Even though he considered himself the final fruit of the Rule of Two era, he still lazily maintained it, since that was all he was familiar with. Though when Sidious would fall, it created a vacuum that was filled by a man who brought about a new order which observed the old ways. The One Sith was created by the Dark Lord Darth Krayt, who considered the Rule of Two to have been a massive mistake, one that Darth Krayt intended to rectify. Instead, there was the Rule of One, the One being the Sith Order itself, under which there would be many minions, acolytes, and lords, with only one Dark Lord of the Sith. Under the Rule of One, the followers of Krayt were taught blind obedience, and absolute loyalty to the Dark Lord of the Sith, instead of plotting and infighting of previous Sith organizations. Similar to the Jedi, Sith Masters trained a single apprentice. However, after their training was completed, apprentices were required to slay their masters as a test of allegiance to Crate. Masters who deemed their apprentices ready would allow themselves to be killed, as long as it was on Crate's orders. It was a strange and a backwards way of doing things, but it did produce results. Having said that, the one Sith had a terrible flaw. That was Crate himself. Bane predicted that this rule of one would never work, as if something were to happen to Crate, then the entire thing would collapse, and he was ultimately proven correct. And the rule of one did eventually come to an end with the death of Crate, the same downfall of the ancient Dark Lords. Well, my friends, this was the philosophical and cultural breakdown of the various Sith eras and their orders based on whence they came, as well as a breakdown of what they believed in and their weaknesses. We sincerely hope you enjoyed this style of video, and look forward to seeing your feedback on observing history such as this in the comments down below. And until next time, my friends and fellow acolytes of the Force, thank you so much for watching. May the Force guide you, and I hope to see you soon.